At 6 in the morning, the cafe smelled like yeast and smoke. Steam rose from tea glasses along the counter. Bread cooled on wooden racks near the back wall, their crusts cracking softly as the air touched them. Outside, snow gathered in uneven patches along the sidewalk, already darkened by boots and tires. To anyone passing by, it was an ordinary place on an ordinary street in East Berlin. Inside, Alexei Sakalov wiped his hands on his apron and nodded to a man he had seen almost every morning for 5 years. "Same as always," the man said. Alexei poured the tea without asking. He had learned long ago that routines were safer than conversation. The man drank, paid, and left. No lingering, no curiosity, exactly the way Alexei preferred it. If any one of the people who passed through this cafe had known who he really was, Alexei would not have seen another sunrise as a free man. He would have been taken quietly. No charges, no trial, just a knock, a coat thrown over his shoulders, and a car that never came back. That was the price of existing without permission. Alexei Sakalov did not exist in any Soviet registry. There was no birth certificate that connected him to a family. No school records. No military service history. On paper, he was a man who appeared one morning in 1966 with a forged background and a rented storefront. In reality, he was something far more dangerous. He was a deep-cover Western intelligence asset living inside the capital of the German Democratic Republic, running a cafe directly under the surveillance state's nose. He had been trained for this life for 8 years. Not in weapons. Not in hand-to-hand combat. In forgetting. Forgetting how he spoke as a child. Forgetting the rhythm of his mother's voice. Forgetting the reflexes of a man raised elsewhere. They taught him to bake bread before they taught him how to lie. Because lies failed under pressure. Habits did not. Alexei rose every day at 4:30. He opened the cafe himself. He swept the floor even when it was already clean. He greeted regulars with the same tone, the same posture, the same distance. Consistency was survival. The KGB did not look for spies who stood out. They looked for deviations. Upstairs, Olga moved quietly across the apartment floor. She had learned to wake without asking questions. They had been married for 3 years. On paper, they were unremarkable. She knew not to ask where Alexei went before dawn on certain days. He knew not to ask about the conversations she overheard in the building. They shared a life built on parallel silences. Alexei watched her descend the stairs, tie her coat, and step outside into the cold. Every day, she left without knowing whether she would return to the same man. Every day, he stayed behind knowing that one mistake, one wrong word, one remembered gesture could end both of them. By 7:30, the cafe filled with workers and pensioners. Alexei moved between counter and oven like a man who had done this his entire life. And in a way, he had. Because the man who entered this cafe years ago, the man with another name, another language, another past, was already gone. What remained was Alexei Sakalov. And that was the most dangerous part of all. The cafe did not become useful to Alexei Sakalov because of who walked through the door. It became useful because of who didn't. Every city under surveillance has a rhythm. Not a sound, but a pattern. A tempo of arrivals and absences. Once Alexei learned it, deviation stood out as clearly as a cracked plate on a clean counter. Most mornings followed the same script. Factory workers arrived in pairs or small groups. Pensioners came later, always alone, always lingering. Party officials arrived precisely when they could be seen arriving. And then there were the men who never stayed long enough to be noticed. They appeared once or twice a month. Always alone. Always careful not to form habits. They ordered tea or coffee. Never food. They paid in cash and never looked directly at Alexei when they spoke. At first, Alexei treated them like background noise. He had been trained not to invent meaning where none existed. Curiosity killed deep-cover agents faster than carelessness. But patterns formed whether you wanted them to or not. One man arrived only on Wednesdays. Another never came before noon. A third always entered when the cafe was half full, never empty, never crowded. Alexei did not write anything down. He carried the information the way bakers carried measurements, by feel, not numbers. Once a month, at irregular intervals, he closed the cafe early and walked 3 blocks east. The route changed every time. So did the reason. On those evenings, he stopped in a narrow alley behind a shuttered warehouse and adjusted the strap of his bag. Nothing more. Someone else passed later. That was all. No meetings, no messages, no acknowledgments. This was not how spy work looked in the films. There were no instructions waiting for him. No updates from handlers. Only a single rule repeated during training. If you start thinking like a spy, you're already dead. So Alexei stayed a cafe owner. He learned which customers preferred their cups warmed first. He remembered whose hands shook and whose didn't. He learned how long people spoke before checking the door. The KGB informants came too, though they never announced themselves. They asked about the neighborhood, about suppliers, about how business was going. Alexei answered without enthusiasm. Complaints were safe. Success attracted attention. At home, Olga spoke about the building committee, about neighbors whose names she pretended to forget, about the way the elevator stopped between floors too often. They never used the word KGB. They didn't need to. One evening, a man named Yuri Belov began coming regularly. Yuri wore government-issued shoes and carried himself like someone used to waiting his turn to speak. He ordered the same thing every visit and sat near the window, watching the street more than the room. He talked about nothing. Weather, bread shortages, his niece's school. Alexei listened the way cafe owners did, present, but never invested. Yuri paid carefully, aligning the bills on the counter before leaving. He returned the next week, and the week after that. This was new. Men trained to avoid patterns rarely failed at it for long. Alexei adjusted nothing. He did not ask questions. He did not offer extra conversation. He did not look at Yuri when he left. But he noted the way Yuri sometimes hesitated at the door, as if deciding whether to turn back. And he noted something else. Yuri never came on the same days as the other men. It was a small thing, almost meaningless. Almost. At night, Alexei lay awake listening to Olga's breathing and replayed the day in reverse order, as he had been trained to do. Not searching for danger, just learning the rhythm. Because once you understood the rhythm, you could hear when something went wrong. By the 5th year, the cafe no longer felt like a cover. It felt like a life. Alexei Sakalov had stopped counting the days since his arrival. Time was no longer something he measured forward or backward. It moved in loops, delivery days, repair visits, Olga's evenings at home, Yuri Belov's quiet appearances. That, more than anything, frightened him. Deep cover was not sustained by deception alone. It survived on erosion, the slow wearing away of whatever identity had existed before. Alexei caught himself once humming a tune his mother used to sing. The sound startled him so badly he stopped breathing. He did not remember the words, only the melody. That was the danger no one warned you about. Not discovery, not arrest, forgetting which memories belonged to which man. Yuri's visits had settled into a pattern Alexei did not like. Every 10 to 12 days, always during the late morning lull, Yuri entered, ordered tea, and sat near the window. He never spoke unless spoken to, but his presence shifted the atmosphere of the room. Other customers noticed him without knowing why. Men trained to observe often failed to realize they could change the space simply by being in it. Alexei kept the counter between them at all times. When Yuri spoke, it was never about himself. He asked about suppliers, about heating costs, about how difficult it was to get spare parts. Questions that sounded idle. Questions that mapped pressure points. Alexei answered with irritation, not precision. He complained about bureaucracy, about delays, about paperwork. Yuri nodded as if this confirmed something. One afternoon, as Yuri stood to leave, he paused. "You run this place well?" he said. "People feel comfortable here." It was not a compliment. Comfort created talk. Talk created problems. After Yuri left, Alexei locked the door and stood in the empty cafe longer than necessary. He did not report the comment. There was nothing actionable in it. And reporting noise created scrutiny. Instead, he adjusted. He shortened conversations. He closed earlier on certain days. He rotated staff hours, even when it cost him money. At home, Olga noticed a change. "You don't sleep," she said one night, her back to him. Alexei watched the rise and fall of her shoulders. "I'm tired," he said. It was true, just not in the way she meant. He had begun to dream in German. That had not happened before. The dreams were ordinary. Repair bills, broken cups, missed deliveries, no handlers, no codes, no danger, which made them worse. One evening, as Alexei swept the floor, two men entered within minutes of each other. The first ordered coffee. The second waited by the door until the first left. They did not look at each other. Alexei recognized both of them. They had never overlapped before. His hands moved without instruction. He served, cleaned, nodded, watched. The second man paid and left a coin face down on the counter. Alexei turned it over only after the door closed. It was nothing, just money. But he understood the signal anyway. Someone, somewhere, had made a mistake. That night, Alexei did not replay the day in reverse. He replayed it forward, because something had begun moving. And once movement started, it rarely stopped on its own. The investigation did not announce itself. It never does. There were no arrests, no late-night knocks, no obvious surveillance vans idling across the street. Instead, the city changed in ways only someone trained to notice absence would detect. The broken streetlight outside the cafe was repaired within 24 hours. It had been flickering for months. A delivery truck arrived an hour late with no explanation, then arrived early the next week and asked Alexei to sign twice. A man from municipal office stopped by to verify the cafe's registration papers, documents that had already been inspected and approved 3 separate times. None of it was overt. All of it was deliberate. Alexei felt the pressure building like static in the air. He adjusted nothing outwardly. Panic was a deviation. Calm was camouflage. Inside, however, he compartmentalized with ruthless discipline. He stopped writing reports for 10 days. Then 20. Langley would understand. Silence, in deep cover work, was sometimes the loudest warning possible. One morning, as snow softened the streets outside, Yuri Belov arrived earlier than usual. He did not sit at his normal table. He chose the stool directly across from the counter. "You've been busy," Yuri said, stirring sugar into his tea. Alexei shrugged. "Winter." Yuri smiled thinly. "Winter makes people careless." The statement hung between them. Alexei met his eyes without challenge. "Winter makes people tired," he replied. "Careless people don't last long here." Yuri studied him for several seconds. Then he nodded. It was not approval. It was recalibration. 2 days later, a new man appeared. He was older than Yuri, heavier, dressed plainly. No expensive coat. No sharp edges. The kind of man who understood that authority did not need decoration. He ordered nothing. He stood near the wall and watched. Alexei did not ask him to leave. He wiped the counter. He served customers. He ignored the man completely. After 20 minutes, the man spoke. "You served in East Germany." Alexei did not pause. "Yes." "Which unit?" Alexei answered. "Commanding officer?" He answered again. The man asked about weather patterns in a town that no longer existed under that name. Alexei corrected him gently. The man's mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly. This was not interrogation. This was confirmation. When a man finally sat down, he ordered tea. When he left, he paid with exact change. No signal. No coin. That night, Alexei returned home and washed his hands until the water ran cold. Olga noticed the redness. "You're going to ruin your skin," she said. He smiled. "Better than ruining the cups." She laughed. He did not. The next weeks passed slowly. Too slowly. Yuri returned to his usual table. The older man did not return. The inspections stopped. The deliveries normalized, which was worse than escalation, because it meant someone had decided to wait. Deep cover agents feared 2 things above all else: attention and patience. In March, a young officer began visiting. He was careful in the way only inexperienced hunters were careful. He watched Alexei, not the room. He asked polite questions. Too polite. His accent was perfect Moscow, which meant he had been trained. One evening, as the cafe closed, the young officer spoke quietly. Your Russian is very precise. Alexei locked the register. My mother insisted, he said. She hated provincial habits. The officer nodded slowly. People who insist too much, he said, are usually hiding something. Alexei turned, met his eyes. So are people who notice accents, he replied. Silence. Then the officer smiled. I suppose that's true. He left without finishing his tea. Alexei stood alone in the cafe, lights dimmed, listening to the radiator click. This was not over. It was merely paused. And pauses, in Moscow, were rarely merciful. By 1977, Café Arbat no longer needed encouragement. It filled itself. Regulars arrived without thinking, drawn by habit more than hunger. Students claimed the same tables every afternoon. Retirees lingered with newspapers they barely read. Office workers used the cafe as a waypoint between obligation and relief. And the men from the security services came because they felt invisible there. Alexei made them invisible. He remembered who preferred lemon in their tea and who pretended not to. He knew who liked silence and who wanted to complain. He never leaned in, never lingered too long, never reacted. He listened without appearing to listen. In intelligence work, this was called ambient collection. Information spoken casually, without fear, because the speaker believed no one important was paying attention. The conversations were never dramatic. A complaint about a promotion delayed. An argument over whose department controlled a particular overseas operation. A bitter joke about someone being transferred to a place with better weather, which always meant punishment. None of it meant anything on its own. Together, it formed a map. Alexei's mind cataloged everything automatically. Names linked to moods. Moods linked to timing. Timing linked to movement. He learned which voices meant authority without seeing insignia. Which silences meant anger. Which laughter meant relief after danger had passed. Every night, after closing, he reconstructed the day. Not word for word, meaning for meaning. He wrote in fragments, using a personal cipher designed to survive seizure. He never wrote names unless they were already compromised. He never described the cafe directly. Langley did the assembling. Once a month, he delivered the fragments through a dead drop in the Lenin Library, a hollowed binding placed back among identical volumes. It was dull work, which made it perfect. By mid-1977, Langley's responses changed. Shorter, more precise, which meant his intelligence was reaching higher levels. Café Arbat had become a listening room inside the Soviet state, and the state trusted it. Yuri Belov remained a constant. He complained about work more openly now, about younger officers who lacked discipline, about administrators who valued loyalty over competence. Sometimes he stayed after hours, helping Alexei stack chairs. You should charge more, Yuri said once. Alexei shook his head. Then the wrong people come. Yuri laughed. You know exactly what you're doing. Alexei smiled carefully. Yes, he said. I make tea. But something was changing. The longer he played the role, the more natural it felt. He stopped translating thoughts from English into Russian. He dreamed without subtitles. He found himself defending Moscow when foreign news came over shortwave radio in his apartment. Not as an American agent, as a man who lived there. That frightened him more than surveillance ever had. Because surveillance ended. Identity erosion did not. The cafe made him useful. And usefulness in Moscow was safety, but it was also a trap. One night, Olga brought him a loaf of bread still warm. You work too hard, she said. You need a wife. Alexei laughed, automatically, but the comment stayed with him. Every relationship he formed was built on omission. Every kindness he accepted was a debt he could never repay. He had been trained for deception, not for belonging, and belonging was beginning to happen. The danger was no longer exposure. It was attachment, because attachments created patterns, and patterns were visible. By late autumn, he noticed the young officer again, the one who had commented on his accent. He did not watch Alexei anymore. He watched the room, which meant he was learning. Alexei understood then. The cafe had passed its first test. Now it was being absorbed. And once something was absorbed by the system, it was no longer protected by anonymity. It was protected by routine. That was more dangerous, because routines could be audited. The young officer's name was Pavel. Alexei learned it the way he learned most things, by listening when people assumed he wasn't. Pavel did not behave like the others. He did not complain. He did not gossip. He did not relax. He arrived at irregular hours and never ordered the same thing twice. Sometimes tea, sometimes coffee, once nothing at all. He sat, watched, and left. Counterintelligence. The hunters. Alexei adjusted immediately. He reduced his presence in the room. Let Olga help more. Let customers serve themselves sugar and spoons. The less central he appeared, the less interesting he became. But Pavel's attention did not fade. One evening, as snow piled against the windows, Pavel spoke again. "You've been here a long time," he said. "Yes," Alexei replied. "Longer than most." Alexei wiped the counter. "Most people don't like small places." Pavel nodded. "Small places hide things." Alexei met his gaze calmly. "They also show them," he said. Pavel smiled faintly. For 6 months, the pressure never lifted. Alexei stopped dead drops entirely. He altered nothing else. Routine was his shield. Langley sent no instructions. Silence meant understanding. The strain accumulated quietly. He slept poorly, woke before his alarm, checked the window twice every night. The cafe remained full. The intelligence continued to flow. And Alexei reported nothing. In December, Pavel confronted him directly. "Your file is clean," Pavel said, standing at the counter. "Too clean." Alexei shrugged. "I don't drink. I don't gamble. I work." "That makes you rare," Pavel said. "Or boring." Pavel studied him. Then, unexpectedly, he nodded. "I envy boring," he said. "Boring survives." After that day, Pavel's visits changed. He stayed longer. He talked about books, about fatigue, about a career built on suspicion. The scrutiny softened, not disappeared, softened. Alexei understood the shift. Pavel had looked. He had found nothing. And now he was embarrassed. In Moscow, embarrassment was dangerous. People who embarrassed the system were removed. People who embarrassed themselves became loyal. Pavel became a regular. The test ended without announcement. Alexei resumed reporting 2 weeks later, carefully, incrementally. Langley responded with a single coded phrase. Stability confirmed. But Alexei did not feel stable. He felt hollow, because passing the test meant he would never be tested again. He had become real. That winter, he realized something his instructors had never warned him about. The goal of deep cover was not to survive the lie. It was to survive the truth that replaced it. He was no longer pretending to be Alexei Sakalov. He was Alexei Sakalov, and David Carson was becoming a rumor even to himself. By 1980, Café Arbat was no longer a cover. It was infrastructure. The city behaved as if it had always been there. The cafe appeared on informal maps drawn by habit rather than ink. Taxi drivers referenced it when giving directions. Office workers used it as a temporal marker, before Arbat, after Arbat. And Alexei Sakalov was part of that mental geography. He was not watched anymore, which was worse, because being watched meant caution. Being trusted meant exposure of a different kind. He noticed a shift in small moments. People spoke freely around him now, not because they forgot he was present, but because they had categorized him as harmless. Fixed. Known. Yuri Belov no longer lowered his voice. Pavel joked about work. New faces came through the door and were introduced without hesitation. Alexei keeps his mouth shut, someone said once, laughing. He hears everything. Alexei smiled politely. He said nothing. That night, he did not sleep. He had crossed the most dangerous threshold in espionage. He was no longer invisible. He was familiar. And familiarity bred assumptions. Assumptions bred mistakes. The intelligence he collected during this period was extraordinary. Not because it was secret, because it was honest. Officers discussed frustrations about Western operations that had stalled. Analysts debated policy changes openly. Names surfaced again and again, people being elevated, people being quietly sidelined. Langley later described this period as high-fidelity insight. Alexei experienced it as exhaustion. He carried the weight of other people's truths every day, and he was still lying. But the lie had changed shape. It was no longer a performance. It was a personality. He caught himself correcting customers about Soviet history. He defended Russian literature with genuine irritation. He stopped listening to American radio entirely. When he thought about the United States, it felt abstract, distant, like a place he had read about rather than lived in. This frightened him more than interrogation ever had, because interrogation attacked the lie. This eroded the self beneath it. Then came Katya. She did not arrive like a plot twist. She arrived like life. Young, curious, distracted, unimportant. She took a table by the window and spread her books everywhere, apologizing without meaning it. She stayed for hours. She asked for more hot water than tea. Alexei treated her like any other customer, which meant he noticed her. She asked about his army service, about Moscow before Brezhnev, about why he never talked about family. He answered carefully, but not mechanically. Something in him responded. She wasn't intelligence. She wasn't danger. She was real, and that made her dangerous. Over months, they spoke more. Books, ideas, small observations about life under systems that pretended not to exist. Katya said once, "You don't sound like you're from anywhere." Alexei smiled. "Everyone is from somewhere." "Yes," she replied, "but you're not there anymore." He laughed it off. But that night, he did not write a report, because for the first time in years, he didn't know which version of himself was listening. When she hugged him goodbye one evening, casual, unremarkable, he felt something fracture. Not fear, grief, because he understood then that if this continued, he would either lose her or lose himself completely, and there would be no recovery protocol for that. The mission had succeeded, but the man running it was disappearing, and that, finally, made the work unsustainable. The moment did not arrive dramatically. There was no single revelation, no sharp break where Alexei Sakalov suddenly became David Carson again. Instead, it arrived the way exhaustion arrives, quietly, after you have already gone too far to turn back. Katya noticed before anyone else. Not because she was trained, because she was paying attention. One evening in early autumn, the cafe was nearly empty. Rain streaked the windows, muting the street outside. Katya sat at her usual table, books closed, tea untouched. "You're tired in a different way," she said. Alexei looked up. "There are different kinds?" She nodded. "Some people are tired because they work too much. Some are tired because they pretend too much." The words landed harder than any interrogation ever had. Alexei smiled, reflexively. "Everyone pretends." "Yes," she said, "but not everyone disappears while doing it." He said nothing. For a moment, just a moment, David Carson surfaced. The man who had once wanted a normal life. The man who remembered open roads and unguarded conversations. Then the mask settled back into place. Katya accepted the silence. She always did, but something had shifted. Alexei felt it immediately. Not suspicion, recognition, and recognition was fatal. That night, after closing the cafe, he sat alone at the counter long after the lights were off. He did not write a report. He did not listen to the radio. He simply sat. He had crossed the final boundary. The work was no longer dangerous because of the KGB. It was dangerous because he cared. Deep cover doctrine was clear on this point. The mission ends when the agent can no longer maintain emotional separation. Alexei had passed that point months ago. He just hadn't admitted it. The extraction request was brief. No emotion, no explanation, just a coded sequence embedded in a routine message drop. Legend unsustainable. Request termination. Langley's response took 3 weeks. That alone told him how valuable the operation had become. When it arrived, it was equally brief. Approved. Execute standard departure. He felt nothing at first. Relief came later. Grief came immediately after. Closing the cafe required a reason. Soviet life demanded plausible inconvenience. He chose illness. A relative in Leningrad. Temporary. Believable. No one questioned it. Yuri brought a bottle of Georgian wine and told him to come back soon. Pavel nodded once and said nothing. Olga cried. She pressed bread into his hands and scolded him for not eating enough. Katia hugged him goodbye and gave him a book, the margins filled with notes. "Come back," she said. He promised. It was the most complete lie he had ever told. 3 days later, Alexei Sakalov boarded a train heading north. He carried a single suitcase. No documents he would need later. No mementos he could not abandon. Because extraction was not escape. It was erasure. The man who crossed the Finnish border weeks later did so in darkness, aboard a fishing vessel that never officially existed. Alexei Sakalov did not survive that crossing. David Carson did. And the cost of that resurrection was everything he had become. David Carson returned to the United States in late November 1985. He did not arrive in triumph. There were no parades, no congratulatory ceremonies in public view. Only a quiet reception at Langley, briefings, and debriefings. Classified commendations. A handshake for men who would never speak his name aloud again. For 12 years, he had lived as Alexei Sakalov, a man fully integrated into a community that trusted him, that confided in him, that had loved him. Now, stepping back into his own identity felt like stepping into someone else's skin. The streets of Virginia felt impossibly wide. The air smelled different. Even the cadence of conversation, the casual rhythm of English, seemed strange on his tongue. Months passed. He went through what the CIA called reintegration therapy, though it was more like learning to be a stranger to himself. He visited his aging parents, tried to reclaim old friendships. Yet every familiar face reminded him of the years lost. Friends had moved on. Colleagues had advanced. The world had shifted while he had been elsewhere, a ghost inhabiting someone else's life. He still dreamed in Russian sometimes. He could recall the smell of the Arbat Street Café, the sound of boiling water, Olga's stories, and the laughter of ordinary people he had come to love. He remembered the careful subtleties of each KGB officer, the quiet way Belov eventually accepted him, the threatening gaze of Colonel Olive and Katia's perceptive eyes. All of it, embedded in his memory, impossible to erase. Carson never married. He never had children. He settled into a quiet, solitary existence, haunted by the paradox of his own life. The mission had succeeded beyond measure. The intelligence he gathered had shaped U.S. policy, protected American operatives, and contributed to the geopolitical balance of the Cold War. Yet the personal cost was incalculable. The man he had been and the man he had become were two distinct people. He had survived, but at the expense of everything ordinary. Love, friendship, trust, every bond he formed had been built on a lie. Sometimes he wondered about the people he had left behind. Did Belov ever realize? Did Katia understand the depth of what she had witnessed? Did Olga ever know how close she had come to losing the man she trusted? Some answers would never come. They belonged to the past, just as Alexei Sakalov belonged there. And yet, Carson carried the lessons forward. Deep cover was more than espionage. It was a study of human psychology, patience, and the extraordinary weight of ordinary life. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union dissolved. The KGB was gone. And somewhere near Arbat Street, the café had vanished, replaced by offices or apartments. Only in Carson's memory did it remain alive. He had become a ghost in two worlds, one where he had truly lived and another where he survived. The CIA continued to teach new operatives about the Café Arbat mission, the success of deep cover, and the power of blending in. But they never taught the human cost, the erosion of self, the endless quiet suffering, and the burden of a life split in two. David Carson, once Alexei Sakalov, lived out the remainder of his days quietly, a man whose greatest victories had been invisible, whose most dangerous work had been simply existing. Because sometimes in espionage, survival itself is the story. And sometimes, history remembers only the secrets, never the soul. After 12 years of living as Alexei Sakalov, David Carson returned to the world he had left behind, but he was not the same man who had walked into Langley so many years before. He had learned that surviving as a spy was not about action or heroics. It was about patience, observation, and the quiet courage of invisibility. Yet the true cost of his success lingered in every memory. What happened to the people he left behind? Did Yuri Belov ever realize that the man who shared tea and conversation with him was a CIA operative? Did Katya ever understand the depth of the life Alex had lived under the surface of ordinary Moscow? And what about the countless small moments of trust and laughter that were built on deception? Can human bonds formed in falsehood ever be fully real? These are not just questions of espionage, but of identity, loyalty, and the human heart. Carson had given years of his life to the service of his country, and the intelligence he collected undoubtedly saved lives and shaped policy. But he also gave up pieces of himself that could never be reclaimed. The simple freedoms of authenticity, the certainty of being known as who he truly was, and the small joys of living a life unshadowed by secrecy. As he settled into retirement, living quietly in a world that had moved on without him, he carried memories that were both treasures and burdens. The scent of fresh bread from Olga's kitchen, the warmth of a shared conversation with a regular at the cafe, the tension of serving KGB officers without betraying a single nerve. All of it stayed with him like ghosts of another life. And that is perhaps the most human lesson of all. That even the most extraordinary operations, the most successful missions, and the cleverest spycraft cannot erase the personal cost we bear when we live in a life not our own. What would you have done in his place? Could you spend a decade living a lie to protect millions, knowing that every genuine connection you formed was built on deception? Could you return to a life that is yours when the person you were has been overshadowed by someone else? History rarely asks these questions, but perhaps it should. Carson's story reminds us that the greatest espionage is not just the secrets we steal or the missions we complete. It is the way a human being survives, endures, and remembers in the shadows. If this story of dedication, sacrifice, and the invisible battles of the Cold War captivated you, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. There are countless more hidden stories from history, each one stranger than fiction, waiting to challenge what you think you know about courage, identity, and the cost of secrets.